when I say Viking, what am I talking about? Who am I actually talking about?
Viking has become the label of choice to describe people who lived in Scandinavia and who then exploded out of Scandinavia from about the year 750, 800 until about the year 1100. So it describes people in the Scandinavian homelands. And here we talk about places like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, but these didn't exist as countries at the time. So when we say these are Norwegians or these are Danes or these are Swedes, we're talking about geographical descriptions rather than nation states, as it were. Although kingdoms were forming in this time, that towards the end of the period would be a more recognizable Denmark, Norway, and later Sweden. So these are the kind of people we're talking about who are living in this area and who are then exploding out into Western Europe. So you end up with a Viking diaspora, if you like, that spreads all the way from, well, Ukraine right through to North America in the end, with a lot in between. But the problem is, many of the people that we now apply that label to would not have considered themselves to be Vikings, because Viking was not an ethnic term. It was more what you did than who you were. And it might be what you did in a particular stage in life, for example. So a young person, usually male, but there are women involved in some of these Viking raids as well. And so there's lots of women involved alongside men in the settlement and the trade and so on. But your typical Viking would probably be a youngish man. Well, I say youngish, I mean 20s or 30s, who was in a period in their life in which they were going out on what we now might describe as muscular free enterprise. So basically, it was going abroad on a raid or trading as well. In some ways, it's kind of a cross between a pirate and an adventurer. They would have had a very positive view of themselves. Those people on the receiving end would have had a less positive take on some of the things that happened, of course. Uh, and then when you achieved that, you'd gone out, you'd made a name for yourself, you'd gone west or east, and you'd made money. You come back, you got the girl, you bought the farm, you settled down, or maybe you pitched in to do a little bit of a political activity at home with the resources you've got and the muscle you were then able to buy. So your Viking was somebody who went Viking in order to achieve something like that, or just for the excitement, just for the making a name for yourself. But of course, that means that there were huge numbers of people who weren't like that at all. They were farmers, they were traders, they were manufacturers, they were people who moved in the wake of these raids into areas that were taken over and settled, and maybe had been moving into these areas for generations beforehand, because clearly Scandinavia knew about the rest of Europe, and the rest of Europe knew something about Scandinavia. So today we tend to use it as a label to cover this whole experience: the Viking Age, the Viking Wars, the Viking societies. Technically, we should call them the Norse or Old Norse, because that encompasses the whole bunch of people who spoke a range of Old Norse languages and were sort of part of the Scandinavian culture. But Vikings is so much now the label of choice that it would seem perverse for many people if I started calling them Old Norse. Although many academics would say, oh, you shouldn't say that because you know they're not Vikings, don't you, those people you're describing? And I say, yeah, I know they're not Vikings. But on the other hand, people kind of know what I'm talking about, sort of. So as long as I have this health warning at the bottom that many of these people would not necessarily consider themselves Vikings, we'll kind of start the conversation there.
So it was like a job description, a job that
Yes.
came in around 700, 800 AD.
Yes. Now, that's a really interesting point, actually, because clearly Scandinavia knew about Europe and Europe knew about Scandinavia well before this. So people, for example, had been acting within the Roman Empire. They had been maybe mercenaries in the Roman Empire. Goods had been going north from the Roman Empire to Scandinavia. So people were aware of it. What happens in this period, in about 750, is a series of changes go on in Scandinavia that cause a movement out of people. And so it begins a new phase, if you like, of aggressive connections. And a number of things fed into this. We know, for example, volcanic activity is happening at this time. That causes problems to agriculture. We know there's rising population in Scandinavia. That's putting pressure on resources. We know that early kingdom building is happening. So some people are going abroad to get wealth and power. Some people lose out on the competition back home and they have to go out to seek their fortune elsewhere. And also, curiously, around 750, huge changes happen in the Middle East, in the Islamic Caliphate, which sees the shift of political power from Damascus to Baghdad. Now, you might ask yourself, what's that got to do with it? Well, it's because there was already a thriving trade from the Islamic world with Scandinavia. And that meant that huge amounts of Islamic silver was flowing north, and flowing south were forest products, amber, furs, but also people, because the Vikings, the Norse, were very much a slave trading and slave owning economy as well. So huge numbers of people were being shipped south as well. And these disruptions in the Islamic Caliphate messed up the trade. And so for about a generation there was a silver famine in Northern Europe. And because silver was so important within Viking society in terms of gift giving, rewarding your followers, making arm rings, etc., kind of lubricating the politics of power, that it was necessary to push out to get that in some other way. And what we see is an explosion of raiding on coastal monasteries, places like Lindisfarne, for example, in England, raids upon ports and trading settlements down the North Sea coast and the English Channel coast, as we call it in the UK, of Europe. And so suddenly we're aware that something's going on. There is this Viking activity, this raiding. It has a cause, but what it does is it makes it feel that something distinctively different is happening. People knew about these people beforehand. There were probably raids beforehand, but a sudden burst of intensity occurs at this time, and the Viking Age, as it were, has started. Towards the end of the period, things calm down somewhat because Scandinavia develops. It becomes very much like the other kingdoms of medieval Europe. It becomes Christian, and it enters into the usual diplomatic arrangements. And this frenetic phase, but it lasts from about 800 to about 1050, 1100, comes to a close, and Scandinavia becomes much more like any other kingdom of the time. But what happens really jerks people awake. They think, this is different. What's happening? What's going on? We get monks writing about it. The raids are quite devastating at times. The destruction is quite devastating. Some armies begin to seize land as well because they think, well, I come here and take it home. Why don't I just stay here, and I can benefit from what was here to begin with? Why do I need to steal it if I can arrive here and control it at its very, very source and take tribute? And so the Viking Age has started, if you like.
Real quick, I just wanted to interrupt this conversation and say it is not lost on me how lucky I am each and every day to get to have these conversations. And I hope you guys, as the listeners, know how much I appreciate the time that you take out of your day to listen to these conversations. And I hope you get as much value out of listening to them as I did creating them. If I could just ask one quick favor, it helps so much for shows like mine if you like, subscribe, comment, do all those things. That helps the algorithm know and realize that there's value here and pushes it to more listeners. And by doing that, that allows me to get even bigger guests, more well-known guests, and have more conversations for you guys. I appreciate what you do so much. I appreciate the time that you take to listen to these conversations so much. I couldn't be here without you guys. Thank you. Now let's get back to the conversation. What was the state of the Norse people, the Norse kingdoms prior to the Viking Age? Was it united? Were they all just separate clans? How were they going into it?
We need to talk about really very, very sort of disparate groups, for example. So we've got scattered groups of people. So what we now call Norway, Denmark, and Sweden are basically lots of little polities, lots of little communities, which sometimes coalesce for political reasons, then break up again. Sometimes can come under the control of a more dominant overlord, but then break up again. So we need to think about a much more localized world, a much more localized environment, because we haven't got those developed kingdoms as yet. And one of the features of the Viking Age is that we see war bands who are associated with particular leaders coalescing, coming together, going on raids, going on campaigns, breaking up again. There's a great kind of fluidity because the communities that they're coming out of are not stable kingdoms at this point. They're much more small scale, and that's how we should envisage it. But increasingly becoming connected. But it's going to take generations for that to be anything like what we now call a modern kingdom.
Mm. So they, it seems like they were more driven by silver rather than gold. Why do they have an affinity towards silver versus some kingdoms favoring gold?
Very good question. There was a lot more silver. I mean, basically, silver was available in much greater quantities in the Islamic world, for example, and in Central Asia. There were large, effective silver mines. Some of the silver mines that we know from later on from Western Europe, for example, and Central Europe, are not yet fully operating. So there is just a lot more silver about, and those kingdoms that are formed in, for example, Western Europe and Anglo-Saxon England, and those groups in Ireland, for example, the various different kingdoms in Ireland, they are moving towards, slowly but surely, silver economy, silver coinage, and so on and so forth. So there's just a lot more silver about. Silver is present both in terms of artifacts like high status jewelry and so on and so forth, but it's also the prime metal that is feeding into the beginning of monetary society that's beginning to emerge in these states. So there's a lot of silver about, and there's an awful lot of Islamic silver about. I mean, literally hundreds of thousands of Islamic dirham coins come from Gotland and from Sweden because the Islamic world is silver rich, and that fuels the trade. So silver is the thing to go after. I mean, gold is rarer, but you just simply can't get your hands on it the same way. Silver basically is the fluid currency. It's the lubricant that makes these growing economies work.
Hmm. So mid 750 or 780, 880, the Viking occupation comes around. They start raiding, they start expanding. Let's start with, I believe it was it 793, the raid on Lindisfarne?
Yes. The one that, sorry, yeah.
I was going to say, what were the people, the monks in this monastery seeing that day when like this raid started to come over? Because I believe it was the first one in England. What would they be seeing?
Right. Lindisfarne is the one that everybody hears of. It was a 9/11 moment. You know, I remember where I was in the UK on 9/11. We stopped, we went to our television sets and we said, what is happening? What is happening? People phoned that evening. You know, my children said to me, what does this mean, Daddy? What does it mean? It was a 9/11 moment, by which I mean what happened at Lindisfarne shocked the whole of Western Christendom. So, for example, we have people who are living in the Frankish Empire in what we now call France, parts of Western Germany, and the Low Countries, and they write back to England. They're Anglo-Saxon monks. They're saying, this Anglo-Saxon monk says, "Why did this happen? It must be because of sin. You must have done something wrong. What's happening?" Because it is that shocking moment. And what we would have seen is we would have seen seaborne ships, so the kind of the dragon-prowed longships, possibly we can't be absolutely sure because there aren't descriptions like this, but probably, you know, rowed ships, but also with sails as well, approaching the coast. And to start with, this doesn't necessarily have to mean something terrible is happening. This could be a trading fleet, but the numbers are going to be alarming. Why there's so many? But there might not be that many. I mean, let's be blunt about this. You know, if you are peaceful monks in a monastery, it doesn't take too many Scandinavians with axes to cause real problems. So we're talking about raiding parties probably in their dozens. I mean, Anglo-Saxon law, for example, said that any group of people more than 35 made up a herra, an army. So armies are much smaller scale. They're going to be a lot bigger in the second phase of Viking attacks. But you're going to see people arriving who are not necessarily dangerous to start with, but you're soon going to realize they're not just after trade, they're not pilgrims, they are here for loot, they're here for people. And 793 sees the attack, the trashing of Lindisfarne. But what's interesting is it isn't the first raid, because the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle talks about another raid that had happened just a few years earlier at Portland in Dorset, and that's dated traditionally to 789. And what happens there is quite revealing, because what it says is that a ship arrived at the coast of Dorset, and the King's Reeve, the King's royal agent, rode down from the royal centre at Dorchester in Dorset, basically to sort out their tax situations, to ask them, who are you? Why are you here? You need to come back to the royal residence. The king's not there, but the king's representative is there. We'll sort out what's going on here, why you're coming into the kingdom. Have you a right to be here? What's your business? And they kill him. So that was a shock. But what it reminds us of, that his first thought wasn't, oh, this is trouble. His first thought was, a trading party has arrived. Only this trading party, it all goes very, very badly wrong. Now, it's more than possible that further down the coast, we don't know this, they'd put in somewhere else where there'd been a much stronger response, and they said, oh, do you want to buy some amber? Oh, we've got some nice furs. Do you see what I mean? So the raider 20 miles down the road, or the coast, I should say, might become the trader somewhere else, depending on what we might call the target of opportunity. So, but what happens at Lindisfarne catches attention because it is a holy site. It's where the Lindisfarne Gospel had been produced at the bit early in the century. It's a sacred site. Anglo-Saxon England by now is Christian, and so to see this undefended sacred site destroyed shocks people, captures the imagination in the way in which what happened a little bit earlier at Portland hadn't done quite the same. And the Franks too had been writing for a little while before Lindisfarne, talking about trouble on the coast. So clearly things were happening on the coast, and Lindisfarne kind of puts it under the spotlight. But we shouldn't think of Lindisfarne as being unique. And what's also interesting is it's a century later that Lindisfarne is abandoned. So they refound Lindisfarne. So not everybody is killed. Some people run away, perhaps. Some are taken as slaves, but some come back and refound it. It's attacked again and again. The famous monastery at Iona in southwestern Scotland is sacked about 3 times, I think, before it's finally abandoned. So it sometimes takes quite a bit of time to stop these places. I was reading last week, I think it was Dorstad, on the North Sea coast, in the Low Countries, is sacked about 3 times, almost every year, for a decade or so. So there is a resilience in people that says, I'm not taking this, I'm going to go back and rebuild my place again, and this is a good trading settlement, I'm not giving up on it. But Lindisfarne captures the imagination because people begin to think, what is happening? Is this a clash of civilizations? Is this about more than theft? Is this Christianity versus paganism? That's certainly how the monks phrase it. Now, how the Viking raiders saw it, we can't quite be sure, but the Franks had been pushing at Denmark and forcing conversion in the previous generation, so there may be an ideological strike back against Christianity here, along with simply stealing silver and monks. But we're not quite sure. But certainly those on the receiving end feel that maybe they are at the beginning of a new epoch. Maybe a clash of civilizations is indeed going on. That's why Lindisfarne's important. And then it escalates. Far from carrying on the same, it gets worse. And that really makes people think we are in a new era and it's looking dangerous.
How did the physical appearance of the Viking look compared to those in England? Were they larger? Were they armored? What were they wearing? How did they appear?
I suspect they look pretty much the same
Okay.
as the kind of people who they fought against. So they would have had a wooden shield. They were particularly famous for their axes, but swords as well. We know, for example, that swords were very important on both sides, but both sides use axes as well. But Scandinavians seem to have traditionally have particular use of the axe as a weapon. There would have been some use of mail or chainmail as we now know it. Some would have had leather garments because mail is expensive. Probably only the elites would have had that. Some would have been helmeted, some not. But you have to remember, of course, that how the chief dresses or how the leader dresses may be different for how the kid dresses out on his first Viking raid. But in terms of the technology of warfare, there wouldn't have been a great difference between them and the people that they were attacking. So the question is, so why were they so successful?
Hmm.
You know, let's take Anglo-Saxon England, for example. Anglo-Saxon England, the kingdoms have been fighting each other for dominance for years and years and years. They were tried and trusted warriors. They were skilled warriors. They knew all about fighting. So why do they find it so difficult to resist the Vikings? And there are a number of things. First of all, is the element of surprise. Remember, we're talking about settled communities, and
Hmm.
you know where you are, but you don't know where they are. And more worrying is they know where you are, but you don't know where they are. So basically, you're at somewhere like Hamwy or Hamwick, which is now Southampton on the south coast or somewhere. You're a trading settlement. That's what you do. Um, then suddenly somebody comes and attacks you. You resist it, they go away, they appear somewhere else. And that's the danger, because it's much easier for the Vikings because they're attacking than the people who they are attacking, defending themselves. Also, the first raids don't come with families, they don't come with their children, they don't come with their wives. So that will change, but to start with, of course, you've got a lot of things to think about when a Viking raid happens. You're thinking, right, where's my wife? Where's my children? Where's my home? Where's my wealth? How we gather it all together? Oh, by the way, where's the people who are going to fight this? You've got a whole bunch of stuff on your mind, whereas the person that arrives has got one thing in mind. I'm going to steal people, and I'm going to steal stuff, and I'm going to kill people to get them away.
Hmm.
So their objective is much simpler than yours. And then they're gone. And with them is gone whoever they've taken. They've taken members of your community, they've taken your portable wealth. And where have they gone? You don't know. They've gone back across the channel to Francia, then maybe on their way back to Scandinavia. So the first generation, for example, up until about from about 800 to about sort of the 890s, it's really, really difficult to resist these raids. Not because you're not skilled, but because it's harder to defend in this sense than it is to raid and run away. Raid and run away. Hit and run is
Hmm.
much more successful to start with.
Talk to me about the advantage of the Viking longship. Did that play to their success? The speed, the ability to take rivers, and how it differed from other warfaring vessels from other nations?
Yes. Now, obviously, the Scandinavians had a whole range of different ships.
Hmm.
So, for example, they had Norse, which are much more broad in the beam and solid, and that's the kind of ship you're going to take into the Atlantic to eventually get you to Iceland and Greenland and to North America, of course, by about the year
Hmm.
1000. So, but alongside that, you've got your warrior ship, you've got your longship, and these have a number of advantages. One, they can be both rowed as well as relying on the wind, which means when the wind drops, of course, you can still propel this. They also have another huge advantage, which they are very shallow drafted. In other words, they don't take a lot of water to float on, to put it simply. And that explains some really strange things, because when we read of Viking attacks, we read of them appearing way up river systems, and you're thinking, well, I get it at the coast, I get it in the estuary, but what are you doing here? And not just big river systems. So yes, you get to Paris, I understand that. The Seine's a big river. You get to London and above that, I get that. I understand the Rhine, they're big rivers. But they appear, for example, in England and elsewhere on relatively small rivers, and you're thinking, how does that happen? And it happens because such shallow drafted vessels can go very, very far up the river systems. And remember that rivers are very, very useful communication methods. They are the way that you connect people up, and often more effective than roads in many places. So they have the advantage of being rowed as well as relying on the wind. They have the advantage of being shallow drafted and being able to get well up the river systems. And we know that because later on, both in Francia and in Anglo-Saxon England, one of the ways of defending against Vikings is to build defended bridges.
Mm.
Because if you've got a defended bridge, then they can't get beyond that bridge.
Hmm.
Or indeed, if they've got beyond that and you're able to build a bridge very quickly, that's less likely, they can't get back down again. Or you
Mm.
can get to a point where you can make it very difficult for them to get back down again. And then they've got a big trouble because they've got a group of people with a nice boat and they can't get back to the sea again. And they've got a problem. And that just indicates the fact that the defenders, they're quite quick on the uptake as well. They realize that we need to make it difficult for you to steal stuff, so we'll make our places more defended. Everybody come in and hide when there's a Viking raid. That's how Alfred the Great responds in this country and others too. He didn't start this system. They're called burhs, or defended towns.
Hmm.
If we get in here with our cattle and our people and our stuff, they can burn the countryside, but they ain't going to get much and they're going to go somewhere else. The building of bridges as well shows how river systems can be used in defence. But it does go back to the point you raised before. What's it about the boats? And these specialist boats are very, very important and very, very useful. But they're not the only boats that are used. And probably many more Norse travelled out on much more workaday vessels, which took them to places like Ireland and Wales and
Hmm.
Scotland and what we now call the Low Countries and France, particularly if they wanted to settle there, taking with them livestock, for example. We know, for example, a bull was taken to North America. Now, you're not going to take a bull on a longship. I don't think
Mm.
so.
With these longships, am I correct in saying that some of them were light enough for the crew to take out of the water and physically move and go around these obstacles?
This seems to be the case. Portages, for example, between river systems. This does seem to have happened. Although part of the complication is that sometimes we're not talking about longships. So, for example, we know that Swedish Vikings sailed eastward along the southern Baltic coast and used the river systems, what we now call Russia and Ukraine, to get to the Caspian and to get to the Black Sea. And to do that, you have to sometimes move across watersheds from different river systems, because some of those rivers are flowing north to the Baltic and some of them are flowing south to the Caspian, like the Volga, for example, or flowing down to the Black Sea. And you have to get your boat from one river system to the other. So you think, well, how do you ever carry one of these long ships over one of those? Well, the short answer is you probably don't, because Byzantine sources say that the locals made log boats. So bigger than the sort of the Native American canoe that we often associate with perhaps the North American continent, and not skin boats, but log boats, which they would then sell to the Norse, who would then fit them out, put sails on. So obviously, it takes quite a lot of muscle and sweat to move a heavy log boat from one river system to another, but perhaps less muscle and sweat than it takes to move a boat from one river system to another. So sometimes something complicated, more complicated, is going on. And as an aside, in the East, we now think a lot of movement happened in winter when river systems were frozen
Mm.
and they moved by sleds.
That's really interesting. Was the Norse unique in the fact that they had like these shallow drafted vessels, or were other nations using them as well?
Other nations were using them as well, but I think what we see is we see a development of the technology in Scandinavia, which then builds, skill builds on skill,
Hmm.
um, and the evidence at the moment seems to suggest that it's a particular Scandinavian innovation
Mm.
on a well-known product, if you like. But having developed that, skill builds on skill, and so these become particularly well built and particularly strong and particularly effective. But people do try to strike back. For example, we know that the English under Alfred the Great tried to develop their own longships to catch them at sea, to intercept them on the way back, for example.
Interesting.
This didn't work very well, which just goes to show that you do have to have a build up. Well, even today, for example, why are they doing all their stuff in Silicon Valley? It's because a skills center attracts skills, which attracts
Hmm.
skills, which attracts investment, which attracts skills. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
So in that sense, the Norse built up a whole skill set, which attracted more skilled people, which built up. So what they had was not unique, but it became particularly specialized and particularly effective. And when others tried it, it didn't always work because it takes a while to build up a skill
Hmm.
set.
Hmm. Before we get too far into the Viking Age, I think it would be beneficial to more understand the Viking psyche and
Yeah,
the religion. Um,
yeah.
was the Viking were they excited to go to the war? Were they excited to go to these battles? And was that just like an exciting part of their life?
I think so. I
Yeah.
think it would be fair to say that. I think that
Yeah.
as well as the um, sort of the natural assumption that you won't get killed, they will. Which can drive and motivate people to do the most outrageous things because they always assume they're going to go back with the great story and the medals and what have you, because people naturally assume that they'll live and others will be the ones that die. But in addition to that kind of that that youthful I'm going to live forever, which would have driven sort of many young men, as indeed it's driven young men ever since that, and young
Hmm.
women too, well, of course, particularly this time, particularly young men. Um, there would also have been a belief system that said it's honourable to die in battle. It is famous to die in battle. Your name will live after you, and that seems to be rooted in a particular Norse aristocratic belief system that says if you want a really good afterlife, if you want to go and live with the gods, and there is evidence for this, we might talk about this a bit in a moment about where our evidence is for saying this sort of stuff.
Hmm.
If you want to go and live with, let's say, Odin, for example, in what we now call Valhalla or Valhall, and you want to have a lifetime or eternity, really, of feasting and boasting and fighting, which many people would not find an attractive proposition. But if you are a warrior embedded in that culture, it's kind of like, oh yeah, this is what I do all day long, and now I can do it. I can fight all day and get killed, and then I come back to life at night. And I do it all the next day. So if you go into war with that kind of mentality, and you add that to testosterone-driven belief that you're going to live forever, and then the think, well, if I do die, uh, it's going to be okay because I might be chosen by a Valkyrie or by
Hmm.
Odin himself to fight on his side at Ragnarok when the world comes to an end at some point in the future, which we might want to also talk about in a minute. But in the meantime, we're going to fight and carouse and fight and carouse and fight and carouse. Then I guess it makes you go into warfare feeling less nervous. I
Hmm.
guess. Although, of course, very few people actually ever commit their thoughts to paper.
Hmm. How developed was the Norse religion that we think of now, Valhalla, Odin, Thor? Was that pretty well established?
That's a really, really interesting question. And I'm going to start that by saying something that might surprise many people. Basically, we know almost everything that we know about Norse pagan religion due to the writings of Christians.
Hmm. Interesting.
Now, yeah, exactly. So that means that in the high spots of this period, when the Norse are doing their most expanding and they are thoroughly pagan and so on and so forth, they're not committing anything to writing. Well, that's not strictly true. They are using runes and runic script to say things like magical charms and someone's built this boat or made that good sword or something. So literacy is beginning to happen in the northern world, copying what's happened further south. But we are dealing with most people in a basically a pre-literate society. Okay, so most of the recording of what they believe and what they're about is made by people who are not pagans. And almost everything we know in terms of developed writing, almost any story that anybody listening thinks, well, I've heard this about Loki, I've heard that about Thor, didn't Odin do this, didn't Odin do that? Almost anything that anybody listening to this will say that they know, they will almost certainly know because it was written by a 13th century Christian Icelander, and most of it by a man called Snorri Sturluson, who in the 13th century, in Christian Iceland, which had been Christian for about 200 years by then, or a bit longer actually, Iceland converts about 1000, who then begins to gather in these traditions, largely, I think, because this is my take on it, they'd lost their potency. You could now write about these things without being accused of being a pagan or without
Mm.
feeling concerned about it, because you no longer believed in these things anymore, and now you are gathering in the beliefs of the ancestors, who we are, where we come from, what were the traditions that were part of who we are. That's my take on it. That what you actually find is they've become diffused because they're no longer actively believed in, or certainly not as they were. And so 13th century Icelanders, and particularly Snorri Sturluson, begin to write things down. And so, for example, people today can read things like the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, and you get all sorts of interesting information about how they thought the world was made, what
Hmm.
the families of the gods were, and so on and so forth. But we need to remember it's almost all written through the lens of a Christian writer, and that will affect some of the ways in which the gods are described. So there is a theory, for example, that the reason why Odin is called All Father, the original, the origin of all life, is because later Christian writers are kind of thinking that all religion must be structured in a kind of a Judeo-Christian way, in
Hmm.
which obviously God is supreme. There's only one God, or if there are more than one God, it'll be like the Greco-Roman style pagan, in which case you've got one God, you've got Zeus or Jupiter and what have you. So what we don't know is whether that was always the case, because there are hints, for example, from sources and also by Thor's hammers that appear as amulets all over the place, that if you had to look at the evidence in one way, you'd say, I think Thor is the dominant god in the pantheon, not Odin.
Hmm.
So in what way does Odin become the dominant god? So it's quite likely that the kind of literary image we get of how it was all ranked in hierarchy was not be how your average Norse farmer would have taken it, and might well have said, well, actually, Thor's more important to me because he controls the weather and the thunder and so on and so forth. Oh, I leave Odin to the aristos. That's a real possibility. Also, there's hints in the writing that there are two families of the gods, and goddesses, of course. There are the Aesir,
Hmm.
or the Aesir, who are the ones that most of us have heard of, your Odin and your Thor and so on. And then there are the Vanir, who are much more like fertility deities, for example, the goddess of love, Freya, for example,
Hmm.
and others. And there is a theory that what we've got here is two different belief systems, one older than the other. Probably, we guess, the Vanir, the fertility religion, which is somewhat older, but this is a guess, but more than possible. And then the more aristocratic, you've got the Vanir there, the Aesir, who are the gods who are fighting and gods of war and so on and so forth. And what's happened is they've been brought together to try to make a coherent whole, but you can still see the joins. In
Hmm.
other words, if you look carefully, you can say, well, the Vanir are there and the Aesir are there, and some of them marry them and some of them marry them, and they have their halls of residence and they have their halls of residence. Actually, maybe we've got two completely different belief systems here that have been kind of brought together, an earlier and a later, to try to make a coherent whole. But it actually isn't really very coherent,
Hmm.
because whilst we think that people across the Viking world believed in these deities, there was no systematic priesthood, there's no systematic sacred text, so there will be common beliefs, but an awful lot of variety. And remember, the most systematic accounts of it have to wait till 13th century Iceland and recorded mostly by Christians. So it is quite interesting. What do we know about the Norse gods and goddesses? Apparently a lot, but there's an awful lot of questions. And wherever the Norse went, they converted to Christianity within about 2 generations.
Really? That's so interesting to me. Before this conversation, I thought that the North religion mythology was a lot more known and structured, and that's very interesting. Why were they so quick to convert into Christianity?
That's a very good question, and it happens almost everywhere. Almost everywhere. I'd say within a generation, but that's probably if that's pushing it too much. I would say within 2 generations. It takes longer in the homelands, in what we now call Denmark, Norway, and Sweden.
Hmm.
Denmark becomes Christian towards the end of the 10th century. Norway, which I've just been, is Christianized in the 1020s. So if Denmark's being Christianized in sort of the 980s, 990s, that sort of period, then that's Denmark. Then Norway's become a Christian in the 1020s, 1030s, that sort of period. There's a pagan pushback, and that's why it takes a little bit longer. It takes even longer in Sweden, really until about 1100 probably. But elsewhere, it happens rapidly. So, for example, Iceland is one of the last places to convert to Christianity in about the year 1000. But in England, for example, and also in Ireland, although the paganism is really shocking and it really frightens people and shocks, they feel the world's coming to an end, it looks like they convert very, very quickly. Why did that happen? Why did that happen? Well, the jury is partly out because nobody leaves a written sources for it. I think there's a number of reasons. I think that Norse religion was sincerely held by the people who held it, but it was very disparate. It wasn't systematized. It did not have that kind of clear base that allowed it to be as resilient as you might expect it to be, despite the axes and the swords and what have you. So I think that's part of it. I think it's much more localized. Therefore, there's much less consistency in it, and therefore it is more, in some ways, perhaps more fragile when it comes under pressure. Now, that's my take on that because we can't be sure. The second thing is, and I think this is important, the lure of the civilized South. That there is a real sense in which, even as they're breaking in and trashing places, there's a kind of a feeling of admiration for the civilized world of the South. For just as barbarians, even as they smashed at the Roman Empire, are thinking, I'd rather like to be a Roman emperor, though. The dream of Romanitas casts a long shadow over barbarians, even when they're breaking up the Roman Empire in the 5th and 6th centuries, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries. So I think the same thing happens with the Norse, that there is an attraction to the South. It's very rich, it's very cosmopolitan, it's very connected. You'd quite like to have a slice of the pie. To start with, everyone's hands in the pie and you make a real mess of it. But after a while, you think, I quite like this pie. I'd like to actually have slices of it rather than just handfuls of it. And so you begin to take land there, you begin to assimilate with the locals, you begin to work alongside them, and you begin to adopt that classic Viking chameleon approach. You begin to get very like the locals. And within 2 generations, I think this happens. I also think that there is an attraction to Christianity. Now, I have to declare myself at this point. I'm a Christian, so obviously I think it's an attractive proposition. So I have to declare my interest in this. But I think it has a lot going for it, in as much as it gives you a lot of information for both rich and for poor. I mean, if you're not a Viking aristo and you're not going to fight in Valhalla, where are you going to go? If you're a woman, if you're a woman, where are you going to go after death? I mean, these are serious questions, If you're poor, where are you going to go? It does seem to be very much geared to a male testosterone-driven world. And Christianity talks about people, male and female, young and old, rich and poor, all being equally loved and all having a route to heaven by faith. And I think there's an attraction to that as well for many people below the ranks of those who are on our radar. So the people on our radar are the wealthy, powerful aristos. If they die, they're going to go to Valhalla. But remember, they're never the majority of any community. There'll be a lot of other people asking questions like, well, what happens to me? And I think there was an attraction to it as well. And the reason I think that is because in England, which I'm most familiar with, there appears to have been no organised converting mission organised. And yet within 2 generations, most people had become like their Christian neighbours and had converted to Christianity. And so by the middle of the 10th century, we've got an Archbishop of Canterbury whose father, I think it is, not his grandfather, whose father had been a Viking raider.
Wow.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so you've got somebody who's believing in Odin and Thor, and within a generation, sort of in 2 generations, the Christianization's happened so much in that family that that man's become an Archbishop of Canterbury. In East Anglia, the grandchildren of the people who martyred King Edmund of East Anglia, according to
Hmm.
tradition, tied him to a tree and filled him full of arrows, in East Anglia are minting coins in the name of Saint Edmund.
Mm.
They've bought into the ideology of the people amongst whom they're living. And in the East, they convert to Orthodox Christianity. In the West, it's the Catholicism. So something really interesting socioeconomically is going on here. And those are my pitches, as it were,
Hmm.
for why I think it's happening. But the debate is going on because the people that converted don't leave a record. They don't say, today I've been baptized because.
Hmm.
It's all cynical. I'm only doing it for the tax breaks, and it makes it easier to get land. I'm doing this because it's really transforming my life, and I now feel I'm going to somewhere after death, and I'm confident. We just
Mm.
don't know.
Yeah,
Ordinary people don't need those sorts of records, and we'd love to know.
that's very interesting. Uh, I mean, as you were talking about converting over to Christian, I was thinking of some of the more uh, notorious parts of Viking and
Yeah,
Norse lore. Thinking specifically about the blood eagle.
yes.
Was that a thing that really occurred? What was the role of pain in the Viking, you know, grouping?
Yeah. Most people nowadays think that the blood eagle was mostly a literary trope to make
Mm,
a point of the savagery of Vikings. And if it ever did occur, it happened very, very, very rarely
mm,
because it is just not evidenced enough.
okay.
On the other hand, so I think the blood eagle, obviously that catches a lot of imagination. It certainly would have caught the imagination of anybody it was subjected to, appalling. Um, but we now think it either happened very, very rarely or virtually not at all, although you can see why it caught people's identity,
Hmm.
caught their attention rather. Um, but there was a lot of violence. I remember one historian said that Eric Bloodaxe, King of York, was not called that because he was good with the children. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
You know what I
that's
mean?
fair.
And in Scandinavia, he was known as Eric Brother Killer because he
Fair
killed
enough.
so many of his brothers, right?
Yeah.
So we are talking about practitioners of violence in a time of extreme violence. And so whilst Anglo-Saxon sources talk about the horrors of it all, the breaking up of the monks, the berserkers going wild in battle and killing people in
Hmm.
terrible, terrible ways and so on, if you look at other Anglo-Saxon sources, when the Vikings aren't around that year, they'll talk about Anglo-Saxon kings raiding the Cornish or raiding the Welsh. And you're thinking, well, that's doing exactly the same thing that's being done to you. You're
Hmm.
killing and destroying and burning, and you're bringing elites to heel by saying we've burnt all your villages. Now, if you keep standing against us, it's going to become economically very, very difficult for you. So come to terms. But along the way, how many ordinary people are killed? How many farms are burnt? How many children are just hacked down? Well, Anglo-Saxons are doing that to each other.
Hmm.
Not all the time, obviously, but they're doing that to each other and to other kingdoms in Britain. But when those things are done to them, and there, remember, history is usually written by, well, if not the winners, certainly by the literate people, they write about it with absolute horror. So we do have to remember, and this isn't an excuse for the past, but we do have to remember that there has been a lot of violence in the past, a lot of violence against non-combatants in the past, a lot of slave taking in the past. Anglo-Saxon England was a slave taking society as well. So
Hmm.
the violence we see being carried out by Viking raiders, I think will have been bad at times, really very bad. But they weren't the only people doing it.
Mm, mm. You mentioned berserkers.
Yes.
How were they different than the regular Vikings, if different at all?
The tradition of the berserker is somebody, if you could imagine this person
Hmm.
in probably a bear suit, maybe a bear skin over them, traditionally, maybe taking on the form of the bear, probably very high on, I think, probably on mind and state influencing drugs,
Mm,
perhaps, or infusions, or just worked up into an absolute ferocious bloodlust, not caring about themselves, not caring about others, and going into battle fearlessly and in a terrible, bloody, violent way. So people like the Berserkers would always have been a minority, but
mm,
clearly there were some would have been psychopaths.
hmm.
Let's
Yeah.
be frank about
Sounds
this.
like that
There
would
will,
attract a
yeah, yeah,
psychopath.
there will have been psychopaths and sociopaths who will
Hmm.
have found their career of choice
Yes.
in a very, very violent society on both sides. Don't get, it's not just on the Norse side, but your berserker is somebody who is basically totally committed to violence, totally committed to the war, and loses control. And I think there may well have been um, agents taken before this to get to that heightened sense of fury and anger. But certainly human beings are capable of winding themselves up to the most extreme degree. And then when you face somebody like that, you're more likely to get people fall back and fall away because they're not fighting in the normal way. So there would have been examples, no doubt, of frenzied fighting that would have caught the imagination. But like the Blood Eagle, I suspect was much more of a rarity than a reality. But then we don't have the data, you see, to be absolutely sure.
Yeah. I mean, just thinking about the description, this man in a bear skin with the bear hood up, high on
Yeah,
drugs, probably covered in paint or blood of some
yeah,
kind, wielding this
yeah,
axe, screaming,
yeah,
yelling, and just
yeah,
being high, probably resistant to pain. So not being slowed
yeah.
down or stopping. Crazy. That would be
I, I,
terrifying.
you and you want to be somewhere else, don't you?
Yes, I do.
When you see that coming, you want to be somewhere else, and any sensible person wants to be somewhere else, preferably 100 miles away.
Yes.
But the point is that means that they would have had some effect, wouldn't they? You see,
Yes.
you'd have
Hmm.
sent that person in, and you'd have seen people go whoa, and that in itself creates the psychological panic in the enemy and boosts those behind you who aren't berserkers, so they can sort of move in the wake of somebody like that. So you can see how panic could happen in another force, and how confidence could rise in those who weren't themselves partaking of that particular style of warfare.
Mm. So we've got a little bit more of the psyche and the religion underneath our belts. Let's go back to Lindisfarne. You said it escalated. What was that
Yes.
escalation after there?
The escalation was clearly these raids on monasteries. And remember, we know a lot about the Anglo-Saxon ones, but they're happening in Francia as well. The Frankish chronicles talk about the same things: attacks on communities on the European side, the continental side of the English Channel, of the North Sea. They're successful. They're capturing people. They're taking them home. They're taking slaves. This is producing a lucrative revenue stream. They are seizing valuables. Um, it's working. It's working. They go home. They get the girl. They buy the farm, or they stay and they begin to take over even more. And that's the attraction, because basically the revenue stream is flowing, and you now begin to think, well, actually, why don't I actually take land in the place that I'm at? Because these are rich areas. Agriculturally, they're doing well, and they're producing all this wealth that I'm stealing in the first place. Isn't it better to be there and take it as tribute rather than, have to risk my life on the high seas? Adventure's one thing, but, wealth's quite useful too. And so what we see an escalation of raids, but we also see a really major change that happens in about the 860s. It starts in the 850s and then accelerates in the 860s. They don't go home.
They stay over
So
winter.
yeah, exactly. They overwinter, and this is really bad news for those who are defending, because you no longer have a campaigning season and a non-campaigning season, because technically that it could be a 24/7 experience. And we know, for example, that Alfred the Great was almost captured at Chippenham, celebrating 12th Night just after Christmas, right in the dead of winter. Now, that should not have been campaigning season, but the reason it was campaigning season was because the people he were fighting hadn't gone home, and they were camped at Gloucester, a town they'd seized, and they were just waiting for an opportunity to grab the king. But in the middle of winter, that just shouldn't have happened. And so in the 850s and 860s, we start to see records in the chronicles of them staying. not going home, staying for a season, staying for several seasons. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes a group called the Mickle Heathen Hera, the Great Heathen Army, because
Hmm.
as this revenue stream flows, group coalesces with group to make bigger and bigger and bigger groups, and they'll break up at times, but coalesce again, and they're becoming serious, serious armies. So, for example, in the 860s and 870s in Anglo-Saxon England, they take out the kingdom of East Anglia, reduce its king to a puppet king.
Mm.
They ride north into Northumbria, where they sniffed out a civil war. The Viking military intelligence is always very tight and very focused. Time and time again, they strike communities that have internal division, that are in the middle of civil war. They fish in troubled waters, and they fish in troubled waters successfully. They strike to Northumberland. The two rivals in the civil war say, "Whoa, wait a minute, I've just discovered an enemy bigger than you." But they get together too late, and they're both killed, and the kingdom of Northumberland is brought down. They then move back, taking eastern Mercia, leaving a rump state of Mercia. They move back into East Anglia, where the king of East Anglia has clearly not been living according to the script he was left by his Viking overlords, and they kill him. In one fell swoop, this huge army has obliterated three major kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England. How's that possible? Because it has grouped and grouped and grouped, and it's become almost unstoppable. And we know, for example, they're not using boats anymore. They're rounding up horses. They're demanding horses are brought to them as tributes, and they become a mobile cavalry wing. So they are a real problem in Anglo-Saxon England. And it only goes Alfred's way in the 870s because as they settle down and they begin to take land, the group that he faces is not the same size, not the same potency, and he begins to bring in defensive methods himself that defended burhs, defended bridges, and so on and so forth, copied from the Franks. But the point is, the escalation is from bigger and bigger, more and more raids, to bigger and bigger raids, to then settling and not going home. And
Mm.
that is when we see the Viking diaspora really begin to grow. So the Normans, for example, in the 10th century, they are Vikings who are given land to keep other people out, for
Mm.
example. England turns into an Anglo-Norse land. The Norse found Dublin, found Wexford.
Hmm.
They become big players in the complicated politics of Ireland. They become big players in the complicated politics of Eastern Europe, for example, amongst the Slavs, and then into Byzantium, because they stay and then they become players.
Hmm.
And but the interesting thing is, as they become players, they start to become more and more like the people they are operating with.
Yeah.
So it's a really curious kind of thing, you know. They become skilled players in the system, and they become to look less like the people they were and more like the people they are playing in the political games with.
Hmm. This great heathen army, I know it's being described by the Anglo-Saxons as the Great Heathen Army, but the Norse you mentioned described themselves as an army with more than 35. Do we have numbers on this army that was coming over?
No, no. I mean, basically, it's Anglo-Saxon sources say an army is
Yeah.
35 plus, and we assume that probably
Okay.
is the same thing for them. Probably hundreds. I mean, I think the Mickle Heathen Hera is in the hundreds. So if you think that you are used to armies that are very small scale, where maybe 50, 60 men make up an army, and
Hmm.
you've got a force of 150, 200 men, for example, then you're quite a force. You're quite a force to be reckoned with. So these forces come together, they coalesce, and then they break up. So, for example, we have archaeological sites now, for example, along the Trent, in eastern Mercia, in the east of England, where it looks like a whole bunch of people, hundreds of people, with camp followers, maybe now with their wives, with their slaves, and so on, are coming together for a brief period of time, and then they then break up and move on. So there's an awful lot of them to start with. So probably what starts off as a raid at Portland that maybe had like about 20 young blokes in it with axes,
Hmm.
and Lindisfarne, I don't know, maybe 50 Vikings cause mayhem. Um, by the Mickle Heathen Hera, we're probably talking about a force that, though it's hard to be sure, will be numbered in the hundreds, even if it's not continuously so. That's a real problem.
Mm.
And I was like, Alfred the Great becomes more successful as that force begins to break up and settles and takes land here, there. That's not to discredit the credit of Alfred the Great, a very impressive king, but he's not facing the Mickle Heathen Hera when he comes against them at the Battle of Edington in the west of England in 878 and defeats them and drives them to Chippenham, hanging every man that he captures outside the burh, forces them into surrender, forces them to leave. And this is written into the island's story. Kids will know about Alfred the Great in England and burning the
Hmm.
cakes and beating the Vikings, but he's not facing the same force as destroyed kingdom upon kingdom when the Mickle Heathen Hera arrived, because it isn't the Mickle Heathen Hera anymore. It's a
So the
smaller heathen
yeah.
army.
So the Mickle Heathen Hera takes 3 of the 4, leaving what is it, Wessex?
Wessex, that's right, and Rump Mercia, Western Mercia is left under a puppet king who later, interesting enough, the West Saxon Chronicle is very dismissive about him and says he was a foolish king's thane. He basically was an elite person who worked with the Vikings. Ha ha! But at the time, that's not how they operated. We know that he and Alfred the Great cooperated on coinage, for example. So it was later Anglo-Saxon spin that said, "Oh, he was absurd. He was just a foolish king's thane." At the time, he probably didn't have a lot of choice, and a bit of Western Mercia survives because of this. But in Eastern Mercia, they take town after town, bring people in, and they're probably always a minority in Eastern England, but they are a sizable minority. And you can see that by if you get a map of England, for example, and you look at the place names, you suddenly find this whole pattern of names down the east of England that don't look the same as in the southwest, and that's because they're Old Norse names classically that end in by, for example, Grimsby, and
Hmm.
so on, and other names as well, and that have Norse names in them, because there clearly is lower class settlement going on in these areas of farming folk who are accompanying the warriors as they then settle down and clearly want somebody to till the land for them. Many of whom will still be Anglo-Saxons. I mean, they're not going to kill the workforce, but increasingly many of whom, men and women, will be Norse. And we're finding, for example, lots of female brooches in the east of England that are very low class brooches, i.e., as one archaeologist said, frankly, they're not the sort of brooch you use to impress your girlfriend. In other words, they're just ordinary people. They're ordinary Norse women coming in with ordinary Norse men, settling in and taking land, farming land, and creating an Anglo-Norse east of England, which will be recognisable right through into the Middle Ages, not quite the same as the rest of England. Different dialects, some different laws, because they are becoming, like the locals, distinct, but increasingly less distinct over time, which is my big theme, the chameleon
Hmm.
Vikings.
Hmm. Why did the this big Viking army stop without conquering Wessex at the time?
Because I think Wessex was too hard a nut to crack. I think basically they're skilled operators. They've operated using all sorts of divisions. We know, for example, that in Wessex, or there are hints in the Wessex sources, they seem to have made contact with some other members of the West Saxon royal family, who they would regard as realists, but the West Saxon would regard as collaborators. But they don't succeed. The West Saxon royal family holds together strongly enough, under Alfred. Alfred is a skillful warrior. He takes on board the Burr system of defended settlements that have been used in Mercia beforehand and in Francia. He begins to experiment with his army to try to make sure that there's always somebody available, while some are getting in the crops, some are defending the burrs, some are fighting, and basically there are richer pickings elsewhere. And there's evidence that groups then begin to drift away from England into Francia, which is more politically fragmented, and they begin to seize land there and raid there. I think it's primarily that Wessex is just too much effort, too much hard work. Go
Mm,
somewhere else. There are other
yeah.
opportunities elsewhere.
I mean, speaking of elsewhere opportunities, what was it? 845, the about 120 longships sailed on Paris. What
Exactly.
what were
Yeah.
they seeing? What was Paris? What was its size? What were these Vikings seeing when they
Right.
go?
Paris. would have been a much, much smaller settlement to what we are today. Now, people will write in and correct me on the numbers here, but I'd have thought that if Paris got to 50,000, it was doing pretty well.
Mm.
And I would have thought it was significantly smaller than that. But I must confess, I'm not an expert in Frank here. So even now, experts in Frank could be writing in, correcting my maths here. But we're talking about somewhere that is going to be, a largish town in modern terms. We're not going to call them a city, but it's going to be very big in its own terms. It's going to be defended. It's got a lot of people there, but the people that are coming up against it are numbered in very large numbers. They're burning the suburbs. They're causing mayhem. They're trying to put increasing pressure upon you to buy them off, buy them off, buy them off. So it's going to be a really terrifying standoff in any kind of siege situation. You want to keep them out, they want to get in. But the other thing is, of course, remember that people besieging a place never want to besiege it for too long, for one very, very simple reason: disease. Disease. You do not want to besiege a place for too long. A, because you've got to feed yourself. Well, okay, you'll say, I get that. I'll just eat off the land. I'll just strip the local area of everything it's got. Well, it will run out. So you've got to feed yourself. And although they don't understand germ theory, they know that if you group a lot of people together for a long time without adequate toilet facilities, bad things starts happening to people's digestive systems and elsewhere. So as long as a besieged place can hold out, they'll take money and go away. But just imagine you're seeing these people sailing up the Seine, and they're burning the suburbs, and they're there. And you think, well, okay, if we hold out, they will go away. We might be able to buy them off. But imagine the fear. It takes real courage. But also imagine the people on the other side thinking, we want to get in there, we want to get in there, but on the other hand, we mustn't stay here too long because it could be dangerous for us. So maybe we'll accept being bought off. And
Mhm.
that's where you find a lot of Viking fleets are bought off. They'll go elsewhere. They'll be back next time because they've decided that they can keep milking this.
Mhm.
Remember, Dorstadt, for example, was sacked every year, as it were, for a decade or so. The English paid later on in the second phase of the Viking Wars, in the 990s, around 1000, they're paying thousands of pounds, which would be millions, tens of millions of pounds sorry, and dollars. Sorry, that was very much an Anglo. That was very much an Anglo view of wealth, wasn't it? Basically, whatever your currency of choice is, the English were paying vast amounts of it, which was later called Danegeld. It was called Herregeld at the time, probably, but not Danegeld, to make them go away. And do they go away? They do not go away because they know that they can milk it again and again and again. But it's trying to make them go somewhere else. Do you see what I mean? So Paris will be paying them off to make them go somewhere else. The English will be paying them off to make them go somewhere else. And when they're somewhere else, they're not your worry.
Friends, I'm jumping in real quick to tell you about today's sponsor, Nordic Wave. Nordic Wave makes premium cold plunges. We've talked a lot about heat exposure on the fact that I have a sauna, but on the other spectrum is cold exposure. And just as important, Nordic Wave makes premium cold plungers that get all the way down to 37 degrees Fahrenheit or heat up all the way to 104. That way you can get the hot and cold. These run 24/7 to keep the water clean with filtration and ozone injection. Now, I've been using mine each and every day, not only for the physical benefits. Yes, I recover better. Yes, I sleep good. Yes, I feel more energized. I've earned my dopamine. But for the psychological and mental benefits as well, it is hard to do something hard. But the fact is, when you do something hard, it becomes easier to do those hard things in the future, and you can accomplish even more difficult things than you ever thought possible. So head to Nordic Wave, use code Merrill at checkout. That's Merrill to save you some money and start doing some hard things. All right, let's get back to the episode. I'm thinking about Western media portrayal of Vikings at this time, and most TV shows, most movies will have like a Ragnar. Is this
Yeah, yeah.
an actual person based in history? Who was he?
Right. Okay. So much of what we get, people will know things from the traditions, that talk about what happened after the Mickle Heathen Hera arrived,
Mhm.
and what we have here are the exploits of someone like Ragnar Lothbrok, for example, Ragnar Hairy Breeches, Ragnar Hairy Trousers, and his sons, and we know about them from the written sources of the time, but we also know about them from saga sources that look back on this period from a later generation, and tell the stories of these people. So we can't be absolutely sure if everything that happened to them and that he did is actually correct. But what we do know is there were larger than life characters like Ragnar Lothbrok, who have inspired things like Vikings, and his sons and so on and so forth. And maybe a Viking chieftain was thrown into a snake pit by an Anglo-Saxon king who thought he could kill him. And maybe that chieftain's sons did get hold of that king and cut his lungs out and threw them over his shoulders in the rite of the Blood Eagle. But we definitely have larger than life characters at work here. And so though Hollywood and modern streaming services and so on are dealing with people who were quite extraordinary, even if they weren't always as violent as they're sometimes portrayed, they are extraordinary people. They cross the high seas, they conquer kingdoms, they negotiate with kings, they take wealth. Even if we stretch out the chronology too much, so we end up having people who had died years and years and years beforehand, then leading the settlement of Vinland and North America, because it makes for a tight story in our minds. Whereas in fact that was done by other people. We've got dramatic people. We've got Eric Bloodaxe. We've got Eric the Red. We've got Leif Erikson, for example. I mean, these are people who are really very, very striking characters. So it's not surprising that our image of Vikings is almost entirely built upon them. We don't get many images of middling peasant farmer who emigrated to England because he felt there were some career opportunities in an area that now his lord had gone into, and his lord has said, "Hey, come and join me, there's land for the taking." Doesn't have quite the same ring, does it?
Doesn't.
And yet that probably was the average Norse experience.
Mm.
Or, the story of a coppersmith in Coppergate, Copper Street in Jorvik, who's making stuff and making quite a tidy living here, and he's able to negotiate a good marriage of his son to a nice girl from a reasonable family, and they're going to enlarge their tenement, and things are looking pretty good in Anglo-Norse Jorvik, now York.
Hmm.
Yeah, it just doesn't make much of an exciting series, but that would have been most people's experiences, of course. And we do need to remember that. And of course, remember, no horned helmets.
Really?
Nope, not a single horned helmet has been
That's
found.
purely Western media,
Yep,
Hollywood.
yep, yep, yep. Probably because Norse gods, who we think are gods, on picture stones are shown with winged helmets and horned helmets. And so there was an assumption from the 19th century onwards that Viking helmets were horned. It would have been disastrous. The whole point of a helmet is, one, it protects your head, and B, it encourages a sword blade to slide off. You don't want anything that's going to cause that sword blade to linger on your skull any longer than it needs to be. Whereas a winged helmet or a horned helmet is going to be more likely to deflect that, and it might deflect it into your head rather than away from your head. And all the helmets that have so far been discovered from the Vendel period onwards, the pre-Viking period onwards, and there aren't many helmets because they would have been elite products. It takes a lot of money to
Hmm.
buy a helmet. They don't look anything like that. They might have a nasal guard, they might have chainmail at the back, for example, but not a single horn. So that's going to really cause problems at Halloween, isn't it? When you now got
Yes.
to take it off your helmet because you want to be an authentic Viking. But
Yeah.
everybody sticks those horns on helmets, and we all know who you are. You're a Viking. So any Viking would have said, "What? What are you wearing?"
Yeah. I've got a sauna right here, and I've got a little sauna Viking hat that's got
Of
horns, so
course.
now I'm gonna have to cut off the horns.
I'm afraid so. I'm afraid so. Somewhere, I think I and my family have a little duck somewhere. Get these little ducks that have a Roman duck, a Greek duck, or what have you. They're all dressed in, and I'm pretty sure the Viking duck's got a horned helmet.
Oh, too bad.
Yeah, that duck's gonna lose his horns.
Well, speaking of larger than life figures, talk to me about 1016 AD. Cnut. Did
Yes.
did
Yeah.
he
No.
take all of
Yeah.
England?
Yeah. Now, Canute, or as he's known in Scandinavia as Canute the Great. So Canute the Great is really important character because basically, there's two main phases of the Viking Wars. So you've got the Viking War that kicks off with your Lindisfarne business, and that kind of peters out somewhat around 900 as the Anglo-Saxons in Wessex lead a pushback. And in the end, they expand into the Eastern Midlands, they expand into Northumberland. Effectively, they bring Anglo-Saxon England, whether it's Norse or whether it's Anglo-Saxon, under their control. So but by 954, you've got one kingdom in England, and it looks like it's over. But in the 990s, the attacks begin again. And they begin again because there's kingdom building going on in basically in Denmark. And so Denmark can now focus the resources of a kingdom against another kingdom, which is far more problematic. So Svein Forkbeard, for example, and others, and eventually we have Canute the Great, will eventually conquer England. So the attacks will escalate. The English will buy them off. They keep coming back, buy them off, keep coming back. And in the end, in 1016, it's all too much. And the Anglo-Saxon state collapses. And the King of Denmark, Canute the Great, as he's known in Denmark and Scandinavia, becomes King of England and King of Denmark. So between 1016 and 1035, when Canute dies, England is part of an Anglo-Danish North Sea Empire. And it's the invasion that everyone's forgotten in England, for example. If I were to grab people on the street now and say, what happened in 1016, they wouldn't have a clue. If I were to say what happened in 1066, they could all tell you Norman Conquest, William the Conqueror, right?
Yeah.
Because the 1066 day in English history is like the big day. Last time we were successfully invaded type stuff. It's all part of the English island story, right? And so we've completely forgotten the Danish invasion, the Viking conquest of 1016. And the other reason we've forgotten it is because Canute was an Anglophile. He spent more time in England than he spent in Denmark. He clearly was thrilled to bits to be King of England. He caused a lot of trouble for the Anglo-Saxon elites. He basically killed a lot of them and promoted new men. They were men, promoted new men, like Godwin, for example, whose son, Harold Godwin's son, will become King of England eventually and will be killed at the Battle of Hastings. But he doesn't cause mayhem to ordinary people. So you don't have a huge land seizure. You don't have a huge turnover in ownership, which will happen under the Norman Conquest. So the Norman Conquest is pretty traumatic for people in England from top to bottom in the end. It is pretty traumatic. Whereas the Danish conquest of Canute is nowhere near as traumatic for ordinary people. So it's just got forgotten. But it's really, really important because 1016 sets the pattern for what comes next, because it destabilizes the whole Anglo-Saxon system. The heirs to the throne have to flee to Normandy, which is sort of ironic given the fact that they're the descendants of Vikings, but there we go.
Yeah.
And eventually won't come back until 1042, when a man called Edward, who will become Edward the Confessor, is going to come back. When he comes back, he's more Norman than English. He hasn't got any contacts in England at all. He's got the blood of Alfred flowing in his veins, but he's not been in England for decades. He's got much more Norman friends, so not surprisingly, when he comes back, he feels he's really twitchy and he's really resentful of the Godwins, who are the nouveau riche, who are the new kids on the block, who are far too powerful to control, far too many levers of power. He tries to get rid of them, then he can't get rid of them, has to marry Godwin's daughter. That must have been a happy wedding. Manages to chuck the Godwins out, then has to force to bring them back, has to then bring his wife back to the marriage bed again. He sent her off to a nunnery. That must have been a lovely Christmas celebration, Christmas after that family get together. And then and then he's looking around for who can I offer the crown to? Who can offer the crown to? And he offers it to William the Conqueror, because basically I'd rather anybody than a Godwin. And then at the very, very end, having tried this option, that option, the king of Denmark later will claim that he was offered the crown as well. We know that there are Anglo-Saxon royalty who'd been in exile in Hungary. They come back in the 1050s, and it looks like they were probably offered the crown as well. So it's basically anyone but a Godwin, frankly. But at the end of the day, in 1066, in January 1066, Edward dies, and he bows to the inevitable. He says, look, Harold, you're Harold Godwin's son. You're the son of this guy that I loathe, Godwin, who's now dead. I really resent you, Godwin family. We don't actually say this, but I bet it's all happening in his head. But at the end of the day, what can I do about it? You are the powers in the land. I can't give it to anybody else. He commends the kingdom to Godwin, and the day after he's died and buried. Godwin is crowned King Harold Godwinson, Harold II, and the road to 1066 is started, the Battle of Hastings, because all over Western Europe there are people saying, excuse me, I think I was promised the English crown before you were. And we have eventually the Norman Conquest. We've got the Danes who invade as well, which probably prompted the forming of Domesday Book in 1086, because the Normans had to get their act together to keep out the Viking invasion. But my argument is that 1016 caused 1066 more than anything else, because it totally destabilized the system. And without it, a commoner, remember Harold Godwinson, the guy that died with the arrow in the eye, according to the Bayeux Tapestry, would never have been king. No way, no way.
Mm.
He only got to be king because Cnut put in new men who he could trust, who owed him everything. You
Mm.
know, like any autocrat that wants to stay alive, they put in people that owe them everything. And Edward doesn't like it, understandably, Edward the Confessor. So
Mhm.
I think we got the Vikings to blame, or to thank, depending how you look at it, whether you're Norman or English, for the 1066 Norman invasion. In fact, a few years ago, my daughter and I wrote a book called 1016 and 1066, Why the Vikings Caused the Norman Conquest.
Interesting. What Edward the Confessor, why was he offering, did he not have any heirs?
No,
Was he
no,
okay.
he had no children. Yeah. Afterwards, this is seen as being a regard of his great saintliness. You know, no sex.
Mm.
But he just probably was impotent or something. We can't be sure. He was married, or maybe, as he was married to Godwin's daughter, maybe he didn't want to put a little Godwin on the throne. So we can't be, but either way, whether it was kind of like, you know, you may have got me married to your daughter, but you're not going to get a little baby Godwin on the throne, or whether he was impotent, we don't know. But he had no heirs. That's crucial. I should have mentioned that he had no heirs. So he was looking round him, and the Godwin family were very, very powerful, but they weren't royal. But they controlled this earldom and that earldom and the other earldom. Harold was a very proficient warrior. He was, you know, an impressive man, but he wasn't royal. He had absolutely no claim to the throne whatsoever. His sister was the queen. Well, that didn't give you a right in Anglo-Saxon England. It was a coup. What happened in January 1066 was a coup, because the one person who had the right to the throne, a man called Edgar Atheling, who'd been brought back with his father from Hungary. Hungary. And the reason they were in Hungary was because a previous generation of little royal kids had been sent round to Sweden, end up in Hungary, because Canute wanted them dead and out of
Mhm.
the way, because they were the sons of the previous Anglo-Saxon king, Edmund Ironside, before Canute. They'd survived and prospered in Kiev, in Ukraine, and then in Hungary. He's brought back, and then his dad immediately dies, which is really politically inconvenient. And so in 1066, there's a full-blooded Anglo-Saxon royal available called Edgar Atheling, and he's a teenager.
Mm.
Who's going to bring a teenager? I mean, you've got the king of Denmark thinks he should be king. He's going to invade. The Normans are going to invade. You've got Harold Godwinson, who's not to be messed with, and you're a teenager. It's not surprising the Anglo-Saxon elites don't even give him a thought. They pass right over him. Nice about the royal blood, but hey, we've got to get some real politics going on here, kid. And they agree to Harold Godwinson becoming king. Interesting. Edgar Atheling survives it all. And eventually, after a few rebellions, he makes his peace with William the Conqueror, and he dies as an old man in the Hertfordshire countryside in the beginning of the 12th century, like an echo of a lost world.
Well, that's more peaceful than most
Yes.
get at that time, so especially with
Yes.
royal
And
blood.
yes. And talking of violence, of course, remember that Harold Godwinson is almost certainly taken apart at Battle of Hastings. One of the Norman knights that killed him is later cashiered and sent home for chopping off his leg as a souvenir. And there is a theory that it wasn't his leg that he chopped off.
Oh, yeah, okay, violence at the time, yeah, that's what we were talking about.
Yeah, violent type. In fact, the only reason they could identify Harold after Hastings was because they brought his wife. He had two wives, actually. He had a long-term wife called Edith Swanneck, who was supposed to be very, very beautiful.
Uh-huh.
But when he became king, he had to marry somebody from one of the elites, and so he put her to one side. Although it clearly was a love match, and he married another girl. But obviously it didn't work out because he was killed at Hastings. But he had a long-term partner who clearly was a love match, and they had to bring her. and she identified his body, according to the sources, by marks on it that only she knew from a lifetime of love.
Romantic. Sad.
Yeah, but imagine the bits she had to look at to
Yeah.
identify
Yeah, for
that
real.
that birthmark, that
Mm,
walk, that
mm,
poor woman. But
yeah.
the point was, he was taken apart.
Mm. So William the Conqueror came from Normandy, which was given, I believe, after the Battle of Paris to Rollo. So the defense.
That's right. So
Yeah.
this is the classic example of setting a thief to catch a thief, or
Yeah.
we now sometimes we have the phrase in England, poacher turned gamekeeper.
Hmm.
Do you have that phrase in the States? Yeah,
We
yeah,
don't.
yeah. You don't. You don't. Okay. Okay. Well, I don't know any poachers either. But the idea is that basically, if you get somebody that's doing things you don't want to do, but you put them in charge and reward them enough, they might keep out other people who you want even less to be causing trouble. So the saying is, you take a poacher and you make him a gamekeeper, and he keeps other poachers out, or set a thief to catch a thief. And that's exactly what happens with Rollo. They're causing trouble. So the Frankish king of France, says, "Look, I'll give you a bunch of land if you'll keep worse out." And they do. They stay there. They become established. They become the Normans. They are the Nordmani. They are Normans. And interesting enough, they become very, very French. So although we think of them as being descendants of Vikings, and they have lots of connections with Scandinavia still. Obviously, they've got a good shipping tradition, because they ship a whole lot of stuff across, including horses, in 1066. So clearly their Viking heritage has not been lost. Most of them are speaking Norman French by this time, and in fact the Anglo-Saxons often call them Frankie. That is French.
So 1066, William the Conqueror comes in. Are we starting to see the end of the Viking era now due to conversion to Christianity and kingdom buildings? Or
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, the 11th century sees a new phase start. All the kingdoms are now Christian, or on their way to becoming Christian by 1066. Anyway, Sweden will linger a bit longer, but certainly by 1100 they're all officially Christian. Now, obviously, there'll be a mix of Christianity and paganism. There'll be some syncretism. There'll be people doing, praying to Thor on some occasions and to Christ on another. But what we can see is the trajectory is quite clear, quite clear, quite clear. And kings are encouraging this, because Christianity is very, very useful as well, because it brings literacy, it brings written court law codes, it helps them actually run the state more efficiently, and so on and so forth. And they feel now they're part of Western civilization. They're kind of the new kids on the block. No longer. They can stand amongst other kings and say, well, we're part of the same kind of family of kings. We have the same sort of legitimacy as you do. So by 1100, this period of turbulence and raiding and so on and so forth just comes to an end. That doesn't mean to say violence stops, because Scandinavians will now crusade, for example, in the Baltic, against pagan Wends and Prussians, and Livonians, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't mean to say that everybody sort of settles down and sort of starts taking up tapestry making and peaceful relationship with their neighbours, but they're going to do it in a way that's more similar to other nations. And so in England, for example, it really is, I think it's 1098, we have the last major Viking raid, when a king of Denmark, who also has connections with Ireland, raids, and there's the Battle of Menai Straits. And curiously enough, the son of Harold Godwinson, remember the guy killed at Hastings? His last appearance in history is at the Battle of Menai Straits. So it looks like that Harold had got a wife, he got another wife, but at Hastings she was pregnant. So his new wife was pregnant. So she then ships out of England after Harold Godwinson's killed, to Ireland, and from there they eventually end up in Scandinavia, where the son, so he's Harold's son really, because he's the son of Harold. Harold's son becomes mixed up with the next phase of, when he grows up, of Viking attempts to take back England, and he last appears in the last great Viking raid, in the 1090s. Then he vanishes from history, and the Viking raids stop. So there's a strange kind of tidiness at the end of it,
Yeah.
which is actually, life is less tidy than that. But basically, by 1100, the Viking wars are effectively over. They're Christianized. They are now kingdoms like other kingdoms, and they're no longer attacking their neighbours. Certainly to the south, they're directing more of their energies along the southern Baltic.
Is it about this time that they've stopped referring to themselves as Vikings or being referred to as Vikings by?
Yeah, pretty much so. So that
Mm,
because it's pretty much what you did.
yeah.
That whole phase has just ceased to be a socio-economic
Mm,
reality now.
mm,
It's different now. It's becoming more feudal, more controlled, more hierarchical, because that comes with greater wealth and greater tax power and greater tax revenue. And certainly by the 1150s, for example, it would have seemed like um, something from the misspent youth of your
hmm
nation.
hmm With the not everybody felt so inclined to be converted to the Christianity that led to the mm, to Iceland and to Greenland and then eventually to the North Americas. Is that correct? Just trying to
Well,
get away.
yeah, good question. The movement is more political than religious. So, for example, in the 10th century, a king called Harold Finehair comes to power in Norway, and he's one of those unifying kings, by
Mm,
which I mean one of those ones who is absorbing and controlling and making it more centralized. So we know that a lot of people move from Norway to Iceland and also to Ireland as well, where there are Norse communities there. Not because of anything particularly Christian about Harold, although Harold is one of those who is encouraging Christianization, but because he's unifying.
hmm
And they just don't like the idea of playing second fiddle to a king, and they create from the 870s, for example. So even before him, the Icelandic Commonwealth is set up, which is a republic, and certainly during the 10th century, we see more people, people like Eric the Red and so on, who just don't want to be under the King of Norway, and they move to Iceland. And then they get into trouble there often. They often get outlawed, or they're too violent, or I don't know, the call of the West. I mean, Americans can understand that kind of phenomenon historically. The call of the West is very, very strong, and they move ever westward, and then accidents happen and a bit of serious exploring, but they get blown off course. Oh, and you end up in Greenland. Oh, that's interesting. Didn't know that was here. Um, and then the same sort of thing happens. You get blown off course. Oh, and you end up in, well, where are we precisely at the moment? You're almost certainly in Labrador, Baffin Island, Newfoundland, from the descriptions in the sagas of places like Markland, Helluland, for example, and Vinland. Oh, where's Vinland? Probably down below the St. Lawrence. Could be in Maine, could even be down into Massachusetts, because we're told there's wild grapes growing there and wild wheat. But the drive to get there has an imperative that's political and carving out a new frontier society rather than religious. But certainly by the year 1000, Iceland officially converts to Christianity in 1000, but it tends to adopt a policy of don't ask, don't tell, which basically says from now on, we don't expect you to be doing public sacrifices, but what you do on your own farm is your own business. You know,
hmm
what's done on the farm stays on the farm you know.
hmm
But if you come to the old thing in future, then you're not going to be swearing your oaths by Odin or by Thor. But what's done on the farm stays on the farm. So there is this kind of very sort of slow Christianization
hmm
of Iceland, because there isn't an attempt to force uniformity. So the
hmm
drive westward is more because of accidents and wealth and frontier spirit, and sometimes having to get out of town. Some of these people have to get out of Dodge, because because they've behaved badly, and they have to move somewhere else. And that also drives the westward voyages as well. And so about the year 1000, not only does Iceland convert to Christianity, but we know, for example, that they're in North America, and we've now dendrochronologically dated Launceston Meadows in Newfoundland to 1021. We know that they were cutting down the trees in 1021 to build the long houses
hmm
in Launceston Meadows, in Newfoundland. So we know that there were Vikings in America in 1021, but they went further because there were white walnuts or butternuts there, and they don't grow there, and you don't grow wild grapes there, and you don't grow wild wheat there. So they must have gone further down the coast, which raises the most extraordinary possibilities as to how far into the North American continent they explored. Could have been down into Massachusetts. Certainly Maine's a possibility. into the Great Lakes? Who knows? And of course, from that spawned a whole cottage industry in producing rune stones. And sometimes they have their own museums. And I wouldn't dare go to the museum and say I think that's a fake, because there's a great deal of investment in these rune stones. And you can even find an NFL football team, I believe, the Minnesota Vikings,
Yeah.
complete with, they got a horned helmet or a winged helmet?
It's horned.
Naturally. Um, naturally. And so there's a vast interest, obviously, in America in these Vikings, and a lot of it has been produced by a cottage industry of rune carvers, I think. Most experts think this, since the 19th century, usually trying to claim European prior ownership to land before the Native Americans that people came across, for example, following the Dakota Wars in Minnesota in 1860s. Scandinavians move in, 1898, find a rune stone saying we were here at the end of the 14th century, before the Dakota were even here, before the Native American tribe were here. It's almost certainly a forgery. But it tells you how they've sold into the imaginations of America. Vinland
Hmm.
is very much in the American imagination, because they got there. America was,
Yeah.
was Vinland.
That's amazing. That's amazing. How would you, in a sum up your feelings, your thoughts of the Viking era in a couple sentences?
The energy, the drive, the determination, the courage. Yes, there was terrible violence. I'm not minimizing that. We're not going to, be revisionist historians and think they all came bringing gift baskets and friendship and wanted to just have your town as you know, a twin town with their town in Scandinavia. There was terrible violence, terrible things were done, terrible destruction. But yet, under it all, there's also an incredible drive and an energy and a determination, which you've just got to be impressed by. Um, and skills in seamanship. I mean, how many boats went to the bottom? Um, and courage to do that. I mean, I just come back from a cruise up the coast of Western Norway, and as we came round the Barents Sea, I had to lie down with my sick bag because I wasn't feeling very well. That was nothing compared to what they experienced in the North Atlantic when
Yeah.
they were sailing, even if it's one of those stouter, sturdier, stronger ships, not a longship, heading for Iceland, heading for the Faroes, heading for Greenland, heading for Vinland in the west. Well, you've got to have admiration for somebody that does that, and
Hmm.
courage. And men and women, it's not just men. It's not just men. Gudrid Thorbjörn's daughter, according to the sagas, gives birth to the first child, European child born in North America, according to the sagas, because she's there. She's there with other intrepid people. There are other women as well. This is not just a man's story. This is a female story. These people sail as pioneers to Iceland and to Greenland, and then to North America. And in the other direction, some of them are ending up on the Caspian Sea.
Hmm.
Islamic writers talk about people called the Rus turning up in Baghdad on camels. You could not make it up.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And
Yeah,
that's why that captures the
yeah,
imagination all over the world.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. For all the misconceptions and for all the wrong images and for all the horned helmets, there's enough there to inspire the imagination for generations to come, as they have in the past. They were impressive. At the very least, they made a big impact.
Yeah. Well, Martyn, this was an absolute joy. I really enjoyed this conversation. And I like to end every podcast with two questions. The first being, who do you think I should speak to next and why? And then the second is based off a Ralph Waldo Emerson quote. If we encounter a man of rare intellect, we should ask him what books he reads. What's a book you'd recommend for me?
Right. Okay. I'm currently reading. But my wife says I don't read enough novels. I got my nose put into too many textbooks, and I'm reading Tudor whodunits, the Shardlake series.
Mm,
And I've forgotten who's written it now. Oh gosh, it's really embarrassing. But the whodunit detective
mm.
is a man called Shardlake, and I thoroughly recommend them. But they're not medieval. They are Tudor based. But they're great fun. And I'm getting really embarrassed. I can't remember the name of the guy that wrote them. And who to speak to next? I think it'd be really interesting to speak to somebody who is talking about the impact of the Norse in Ireland. Now, because that's a really fascinating topic as well, and I'm not as sharp on my Irish historians as I should be, but that would be worth researching because they play a really interesting role in Ireland, where again the tradition often places them as being the pagans against the Christians, but we know they were fighting on both sides at the Battle of Clontarf, and they're part of the Irish story as well. And we often focus very much on the English story, but I think it would be really good to know more about the Irish story, and I know a little bit about it, but not a lot, and therefore I can point you in the direction of a geographical area, but I'm afraid you'll have to research the appropriate Irish historian yourself because I have
myself.
failed you. I have failed you, Jace.
Impossible. Well, this, as I mentioned, I am in the pursuit of more historians for the
Mm.
podcast because I'm fascinated by it, and so that's definitely something I will reach out to. Where can people get more exposure to your work and to your books?
My two recent books are American Vikings, How the Norse Sailed into the Lands and Imaginations of America, and that's published by Pegasus Books, New York. I think it was 2023. And my most recent book is entitled Vikings in the East, From Vladimir the Great to Vladimir Putin, The Origins of a Contested Legacy in Russia and Ukraine, and that's produced or published by Biteback Books of London 2025. So whilst one says about the Vikings that sailed hugely to the west, the other one looks at Vikings that sailed hugely to the east, including those that turned up in Baghdad on camels.
Mm, mm. Yeah, as we were talking about it, the more I realized we have hours and hours more that we could be talking about it. We just concentrated in the England, Francia,
Yeah,
Denmark area, and we didn't even go to the west or to the east. So that'll be our next conversation to branch out.
I would love to chat, and it'd be really interesting at some point to talk about how the Viking Rus are entangled in the deeply contested origin stories of Russia and Ukraine that's being played out at the moment, including in things that are being said by both sides. It's not just a kind of historic event. Both sides are still actively claiming them. Um, and that's a fascinating story as well, as they lie at the origins of Holy Russia, which is now also deeply contested. So why does Putin say some of the things he says? It's only explainable by Vikings.
So that's crazy to me that they have such a influence still, and to all these great nations.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, Martin, this again was an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation and your time.
It's been great to be with you. I hope it's been of interest. And Vikings, yeah, what a story.
What a story.